The night started with the sound of singing. Sweet, cheerful voices drifted through the cold December air, growing louder as they approached our house. I peeked through the curtains and saw them. Carolers, about a dozen people, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, stood in a tight group on our snow-covered lawn. Their faces were pale and expressionless, but their voices were beautiful, almost hypnotic. My mom smiled as she walked to the door. "How lovely," she said, opening it wide to let the music in. The singing didn't stop as the carolers turned their heads toward her in perfect unison. Their eyes gleamed strangely in the light spilling out from the doorway, but I told myself it was just a trick of the shadows. Mom invited them in, saying it was too cold to stand outside. I didn't like it. Something about them felt off. They moved too smoothly, too silently, as they stepped into our warm living room. Their clothes didn't seem wet, even though the snow outside was deep. They continued singing, never stopping for a breath. Their voices filled the house, beautiful but eerie. I noticed their faces didn't change. No smiles, no blinking, just blank stares. I tugged at Mom's sleeve, whispering, "Don't you think it's weird?" She brushed me off. "They're just really into the Christmas spirit," she said, though she sounded uncertain. The carolers formed a circle in the middle of the room, their singing growing louder. The lights flickered, then dimmed, as if the house couldn't handle the weight of their voices. My dad came downstairs, frowning. "What's going on?" he asked. But the moment he saw them, his face paled. He didn't say anything else. He just stared. That's when I noticed something horrifying. One of the carolers, a tall man with a black top hat, had stopped singing. His lips weren't moving, but the voice was still there as if it was coming from somewhere else. He turned his head toward me, his pale eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran down my spine as he slowly smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. The others stopped singing one by one, but the music didn't stop. It grew louder, echoing through the house like it was coming from the walls. My mom tried to speak, but no sound came out. My dad backed away, his face frozen in terror. The carolers began to move, their steps slow and deliberate. They didn't speak, didn't blink. The tall man in the hat reached out a hand, his fingers impossibly long and thin, and pointed at me. My chest tightened as if I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in, the flickering lights casting dancing shadows that looked alive. I grabbed my mom's hand and pulled her toward the door. "We have to leave," I screamed, but the carolers blocked the way. Their blank faces twisted into cruel smiles as they started humming, a deep, vibrating sound that made the air feel heavy. Suddenly, all the lights went out. The house was pitch black, and the humming grew louder, vibrating through my bones. I couldn't see, couldn't move. I could feel them, though, their cold presence closing in. When the lights flickered back on, the carolers were gone. The house was silent. My parents and I stood there, trembling, too afraid to speak. But on the floor, where they had stood, were wet footprints leading to the door. The snow outside was untouched. We left that house the next day, but every Christmas Eve since, I hear faint singing in the distance, growing louder, closer. And I know, they're still out there, waiting to finish their song. It was Christmas Eve, and the house was filled with the warm glow of lights and the sound of soft carols playing in the background. My little brother, Tim, was buzzing with excitement, barely able to wait for Santa's arrival. My parents had promised to stay up late with us, but by midnight, they'd both gone to bed, leaving me in charge. I was 16, old enough to handle it. Or so I thought. Tim had finally fallen asleep on the couch, clutching a half-eaten cookie he'd left for Santa. I sat by the fireplace, scrolling through my phone, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the old house settling. That's when I heard it. A faint jingle. It wasn't the soft, cheerful sound of bells on a Christmas decoration. It was sharper, heavier, and it was coming from outside. I froze, my eyes darting toward the window. The snow outside shimmered under the streetlights, undisturbed. Everything was still. Too still. Then came the knock. It was slow, deliberate, and echoed through the silent house. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked to the front door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw him. A man in a Santa suit, his beard thick and white, his suit bright red against the snow. But something about him was wrong. His posture was stiff, his head tilted slightly to the side like he was studying the door. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's Santa," he said, his voice deep and scratchy. "I have gifts for the children." A chill ran down my spine. My parents hadn't hired anyone to dress up as Santa. "You have the wrong house," I said, backing away from the door. The knocking came again, harder this time. "Let me in," he said, his voice sharper now, more insistent. I grabbed Tim and carried him upstairs to my room, locking the door behind us. I shook him awake, whispering for him to stay quiet. His sleepy eyes widened when I told him what was happening. The knocking turned into pounding, and I heard the doorknob rattling. Then, silence. For a moment, I thought he was gone. But then came the sound of heavy boots crunching through the snow, moving toward the back of the house. I heard the faint jingle again, followed by the sound of a window sliding open. My heart sank. I whispered to Tim to hide in the closet while I grabbed my dad's old baseball bat from under the bed. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, each step louder than the last. My breath caught in my throat as the doorknob to my room twisted. It didn't open. The lock held. But then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh, just on the other side of the door. "I see you," he whispered. The door creaked as it strained against the lock. Then the pounding started again, so hard I thought the door would splinter. I gripped the bat tightly, ready to fight, but the pounding stopped abruptly. The silence was worse than the noise. I heard his footsteps retreat, moving back down the hall, and then the jingle of bells fading into the night. I waited for hours, clutching the bat, my ears straining for any sound. But he never came back. In the morning, the police found the snow by the back window disturbed, along with deep boot prints leading into the woods. They said it was probably some drunk playing a prank, but I knew better. There was nothing human about the way he moved or the way his laughter stayed with me, echoing in my ears long after he was gone. That Christmas, I learned that not every Santa is here to bring joy. Some come to take it away. The snow fell heavy that Christmas Eve, blanketing everything in a strange, silent calm. The lights on our Christmas tree twinkled, casting soft shadows on the walls, and the smell of cookies baking filled the house. It was supposed to be perfect, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way the wind howled louder than usual, or the faint flicker in the lights, like the house was holding its breath. Around 9 p.m., just as we were settling in with mugs of hot cocoa, the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and for a moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the windows. "That's odd," Dad muttered, grabbing a flashlight. "The weather's bad, but it's not storming that hard." I pulled my blanket tighter around me, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about the darkness felt wrong, like it wasn't just the lights that had gone out, but something deeper, something alive. Mom lit some candles, their flickering flames casting long, eerie shadows across the room. That's when we heard it. A low, distant hum. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was rhythmic, like a low, guttural chant. It was coming from outside. Dad frowned, heading toward the window. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. He peeked through the curtains, and I watched his face change. His usual calm expression twisted into something I'd never seen before. Fear. Without a word, he stepped back and locked the door. "What did you see?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing," he said quickly. Too quickly. The hum grew louder, filling the room with an almost physical presence. It felt like it was pressing against my skin, crawling into my ears. Then came the knock. Soft at first, just a gentle tap on the door. Then harder, more insistent. "Don't answer it," Dad whispered, his voice low and urgent. We sat frozen as the knocking continued. Then came another sound, a soft scraping, like nails dragging against the wood. It moved from the door to the windows, circling the house. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever, or whatever was outside could hear it. "Is someone out there?" I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. Dad didn't answer. He just motioned for us to stay quiet. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Too still. Then we heard the sound of footsteps inside the house. I grabbed Mom's hand, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like whoever was walking wanted us to know they were there. The flashlight in Dad's hand flickered and died, plunging us into near-total darkness. The candles sputtered, their flames dancing wildly before going out one by one. Then came the voice, low, raspy, and cold as the winter wind. "You shouldn't be here." It seemed to come from everywhere at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The air felt thick, suffocating. In the faint moonlight streaming through the window, I saw it. A tall, shadowy figure standing in the corner. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of red in the dark. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, heavy and malevolent. The next thing I remember is waking up on Christmas morning. The lights were back on, the house warm and bright, but something was wrong. The front door was wide open, snow blowing in across the floor. Dad wouldn't talk about what happened, and Mom just kept saying it was a bad dream, but I knew it wasn't. We left that house a week later, never to return. But even now, every Christmas Eve, I can hear that faint hum in the wind, and I know it's still out there, waiting. It was Christmas Eve, and the storm outside made the house feel smaller than ever. The wind howled against the windows, and the heavy snowfall muffled every sound. Inside, the warmth of the fireplace flickered softly, and the Christmas tree stood in the corner, glowing with multicolored lights. It was the only comfort in an otherwise eerie night. I was alone, waiting for my parents to return from a last-minute trip to town. They had left hours ago, and the storm had worsened since. The quiet began to press against my ears, so I turned on the TV to distract myself. Static filled the screen. I flipped through the channels, but it was all the same. A low hiss of static that only added to the unease. Then all at once the lights went out. The house plunged into darkness and the sudden silence was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. My breath hitched and I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam illuminated the living room in shaky shadows, but something felt wrong. The tree. Its lights were still on, glowing softly in the corner. But the power was out. There was no generator, no battery pack, nothing that could explain it. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so loudly I could feel it in my throat. The lights on the tree seemed brighter now, almost pulsing. They cast strange, twisting shadows on the walls, making the ornaments look like distorted faces. I told myself it was just a glitch, maybe a leftover charge in the wires. But then the lights changed. They flickered, not like they were broken, but like they were alive. The colors danced in patterns, faster and faster, and I realized they weren't random. They were forming shapes, letters, run. I froze, the word burning into my mind. My hands trembled as I backed away from the tree. The lights pulsed again, and this time, the ornaments began to move. The glass balls twisted and turned on their hooks, and the angel on top tilted its head slowly, its hollow eyes staring down at me. The tree began to creak, the branches shifting as though something was crawling through them. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into total darkness. When it came back on, I saw it. A figure, small and hunched, stood beside the tree. Its body was covered in jagged shadows, but its eyes glowed the same eerie colors as the lights. It grinned, revealing sharp, uneven teeth that glistened in the dim glow. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table. The figure moved closer, its footsteps silent despite the creaking floorboards. It reached out a gnarled hand, and the tree lights flared violently, illuminating the room in a blinding, unnatural light. I don't remember screaming, but I must have. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor. The tree was dark now, its lights completely dead. My phone's flashlight had died too, and the house was silent again. When my parents returned later that night, I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. The tree was just a tree again, lifeless and ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the lights to go out again. It was Christmas Eve, and the snowstorm outside had turned the world white and silent. Our family was gathered in the cozy warmth of the living room. The Christmas tree sparkled with colorful lights, and the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. It felt like the perfect night, until the knock came. It was faint at first, like someone tapping gently. My mom paused, her mug of cocoa halfway to her lips. "Did you hear that?" she asked. My dad shrugged it off. "Probably the wind," he said. But I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 sharp raps, clear and deliberate. It echoed through the quiet house, cutting through the hum of Christmas music playing softly on the radio. My little sister Emma clutched her stuffed reindeer and whispered, "Who would be out in a storm like this?" No one moved. We all just stared at the front door. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just the sound of the knock that unnerved me. It was the feeling that came with it, like we weren't alone anymore. My dad finally stood up. "Probably a neighbor," he muttered, though his voice didn't sound confident. He walked to the door, hesitated, and looked back at us. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer. The storm outside was howling, but the knocks had been so clear, so close. My dad unlocked the door and cracked it open. A gust of freezing air rushed in and he peeked outside. There was no one there, just snow, piling high and untouched except for our footprints from earlier. He closed the door and bolted it, shaking his head. "Must have been the wind," he said again, but none of us believed him. The night went on, but something felt wrong. The fire didn't seem as warm, the tree lights flickered more than usual, and the house felt heavy, like something was watching us. Emma fell asleep on the couch, clutching her reindeer, and my mom suggested we all head to bed. That's when the knocking came back. This time it was louder, more urgent, like someone was pounding on the door with both fists. My mom gasped, and Emma woke up crying. My dad grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to follow him. I didn't want to, but I couldn't just sit there. We crept to the door, my dad whispering for me to stay back. He opened it again, wider this time, shining the flashlight into the storm. Still, no one was there. But then I saw them. Footprints in the snow. Small, like a child's, leading from the woods to our front porch. But there were no footprints leaving. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My dad stepped outside, calling, "Hello? Is someone out here?" The wind swallowed his voice, and he came back inside, locking the door tight. "No one's out there," he said, but his face was pale. The knocking stopped after that, but the night was far from over. Around midnight, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. I held Emma close as she sobbed, and my mom lit candles, her hands shaking. Then, we heard it. A soft, muffled laugh coming from somewhere in the house. It wasn't outside anymore. It was with us. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the halls, and then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps. My dad grabbed the fireplace poker, but we all knew it wouldn't help. Whatever had knocked wasn't human. We never saw it. But by morning, the front door was wide open, and the snow outside was marked with small footprints leading away from the house. Christmas dinner was supposed to be perfect. My family had gathered in the old house we'd all grown up in, our first Christmas together in years. The dining table was set with our best china, candles flickered, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the air. Laughter echoed through the room as we reminisced about past holidays, sharing stories and old memories. But there was something off. I noticed it first when we all sat down at the table. There were 12 chairs, but only 11 of us. My mom had insisted on setting the extra place just in case, though she laughed it off when we questioned her. "It's tradition," she said, but we'd never done that before. Dinner started and everything seemed fine, until the candles flickered. Not just a small flicker from a draft, but violently, as if a gust of wind had swept through the room. Everyone paused, glancing around. My dad muttered something about old houses and loose windows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then I saw it. The chair at the end of the table moved, just a little. I stared, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My sister rolled her eyes. "It's just your imagination," she said. But I knew what I'd seen. The meal went on, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to that empty chair, expecting it to move again. And then, as my mom passed the gravy, I noticed her glance at the empty seat and quickly look away. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "Mom, what's wrong?" I asked. She shook her head, forcing a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just tired." But I could see it in her eyes. She was scared. Halfway through the meal, things got worse. The room grew colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. The windows were shut, and the fireplace was roaring, yet the cold was unmistakable. My uncle joked about a ghost stealing our heat, but no one laughed. Then the whispers started. Faint, almost inaudible, like someone was speaking just out of reach. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the expressions on everyone's faces told me they heard it too. My little cousin burst into tears, pointing at the empty chair. "There's someone there," she cried, her voice trembling. The chair slid back with a loud screech and everyone froze. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a low, unintelligible murmur. My mom stood up, her hands clutching the tablecloth. "We need to leave," she said, her voice firm but shaking. "Now." As we scrambled to leave, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow of the candles. And then we saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing at the end of the table where the empty chair had been. Its face was obscured, but its eyes glowed faintly, watching us. We didn't wait. We ran, leaving everything behind. Outside in the snow, we huddled together, too scared to go back inside. My mom finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't set that place," she said. "I don't know who did." To this day, no one talks about what happened that night. The house has been empty ever since, but sometimes when I drive past it, I swear I can see a figure standing in the dining room window, waiting for someone to join them at the table. The snow was falling lightly as we gathered in my aunt's old house for Christmas Eve. It was our family tradition to do a gift exchange. This year, the gifts were placed in a pile under the tree, wrapped in bright paper and ribbons. There was nothing unusual about it at first, just laughter, the smell of hot cocoa, and the warmth of the fireplace. But as the night went on, something didn't feel right. It started when my cousin Ellie picked a small, black-wrapped box from the pile. No one remembered wrapping it. We all glanced at each other, confused. But Ellie shrugged. "It's probably from someone who forgot to write a name on it," she said, tearing the paper off. Inside was an old, tarnished locket. It looked like it had been buried for years. Ellie opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a woman with hollow eyes. A chill ran down my spine, and I wasn't the only one who felt it. "Creepy," Ellie muttered, closing the locket and setting it aside. The exchange continued, but the mood had shifted. The laughter was quieter now, the smiles forced. I tried to shake off the unease as I picked my own gift, a heavy box wrapped in gold paper. Inside was a wooden music box. When I wound it up, a haunting melody played. The tune was beautiful, but strange, like something from a dream you couldn't quite remember. The room seemed colder as the music echoed around us. That's when the strange things started happening. The Christmas tree lights flickered, though they'd never done that before. The fire in the hearth dimmed, the flames shrinking until they were almost gone. My aunt got up to adjust the thermostat, but it didn't help. The room felt like ice. Ellie gasped suddenly, clutching the locket around her neck. "It's burning me!" she cried, yanking it off and throwing it onto the floor. The locket landed with a metallic clang, its lid snapping open. The woman in the photograph seemed different. Her smile was wider now, her eyes sharper. "Did you see that?" Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, the music box started playing again on its own. The tune was faster now, more frantic, like a warning. The lights flickered wildly, and the shadows on the walls began to move. They twisted and stretched, forming shapes that didn't belong to anything in the room. One of the shadows broke away from the wall. It loomed in the corner, tall and thin with glowing eyes that burned like coals. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It moved closer, its footsteps silent on the wooden floor. Someone screamed and the lights went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound the relentless melody of the music box. I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder, and I bolted, stumbling toward the door. The others were right behind me, their breaths ragged and terrified. We didn't stop running until we were outside in the snow. When we turned back to look at the house, the windows were dark, except for one, a faint flickering light by the Christmas tree. The music box was still playing. No one spoke as we drove away. We left the gifts, the decorations, everything. We never went back to that house, and we never found out where that black-wrapped box came from. But every Christmas Eve since, I hear that haunting melody in my dreams, and I wake up cold no matter how warm the room is. It was Christmas Eve, and the snowstorm outside made everything feel magical yet eerily quiet. The house was warm and glowing with soft lights from the Christmas tree. I was sitting by the window, sipping hot chocolate, watching the snow fall and blur the world beyond the frosted glass. It was supposed to be a cozy night. It was anything but. The frost on the window created strange patterns, almost like faces. I traced one with my finger, amused at how it seemed to change when I looked away. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving just beyond the glass. At first, I thought it was the tree branches swaying in the wind, but then it moved again. This time, it stayed still, just standing there. The shadow was tall and oddly shaped, like a person wearing a long coat with something draped over their head. My heart skipped a beat. The storm was too strong for anyone to be out there. I leaned closer to the window, my breath fogging up the glass, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. At least I think it was staring. I couldn't see a face, just a dark, featureless outline. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Maybe the frost and snow were playing tricks on me. But then it moved again, closer to the house. My stomach twisted in knots as the shadow's shape became clearer. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide across the snow. I called out for my mom, but she was upstairs wrapping presents. My little sister was already asleep. I didn't want to scare anyone, so I stayed quiet and kept watching, hoping it would go away. But it didn't. It pressed closer to the window until I could see the faint outline of hands, thin, bony fingers on the glass. My chest tightened as I realized there was no reflection in the window, only the shadow itself. Suddenly the lights flickered. The Christmas tree dimmed for a moment before coming back to life. I jumped, knocking over my cup of hot chocolate. The shadow was gone. I stared at the window, my heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing there anymore. Just frost and the storm raging outside. I tried to shake off the fear and clean up the mess, but something made me look again. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow wasn't outside anymore. It was inside the room, reflected in the glass. It was standing right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The lights flickered again, and this time, the Christmas tree went out completely. The darkness swallowed the room, and I could hear the sound of something scraping against the floor. It was faint at first, then louder, coming closer. I backed away toward the stairs, trying not to scream. My hands fumbled for the light switch, but it didn't work. Then I saw it, a tall, thin figure emerging from the shadows, its face still hidden beneath that strange, draped shape. It tilted its head, almost like it was studying me. I screamed and bolted upstairs, slamming the door to my room. I huddled under my blanket, shaking, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house was silent again, except for the sound of the wind outside. When I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, the frost was gone. The snow had stopped falling, and the world looked normal again. But I knew it wasn't over. On the glass, etched as if by a finger, was a single word: soon. The snow fell heavily that Christmas night, blanketing the streets in white as I arrived at Sarah's house for the party. The place looked magical, with glowing lights wrapped around the trees and music spilling out from inside. Everyone was there, laughing, dancing, and sipping on eggnog. It felt warm and safe, like the kind of Christmas you see in movies. But something about the air felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling, even as I forced a smile and joined the others. The party was in full swing when Sarah brought out the game. It was an old board she'd found in her grandmother's attic, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Its surface was dark wood, and the letters carved into it seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. "It's just a game," Sarah laughed when she saw my face. "Don't be such a baby." Reluctantly, I joined the circle on the floor. We all placed our fingers on the planchette and started asking it questions. At first, it didn't move, and we all laughed nervously, teasing each other about pushing it. But then it started to slide, slowly, deliberately. None of us were laughing anymore. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. The planchette spelled out IAMHERE. The room went quiet. The lights flickered, and I felt a cold breeze even though all the windows were shut. I wanted to stop, to tell everyone this wasn't funny anymore, but something kept me frozen in place. "What do you want?" someone whispered. The board responded, YOU. The candles blew out all at once, plunging the room into darkness. Someone screamed, and I scrambled to my feet, fumbling for my phone. When the light from my screen finally illuminated the room, Sarah was gone. I could still hear her scream echoing faintly, but she wasn't there. We searched the entire house, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. Her coat was still on the rack, her phone on the table. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Then we heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to Sarah. Jake, the bravest of us, decided to check. "It's probably her trying to scare us," he said, though his voice wavered. He climbed the stairs while we waited at the bottom, clutching each other like children. "Sarah?" he called out. There was no answer. Then a loud crash echoed from above, followed by Jake's scream. It was cut off so suddenly it made my blood run cold. I wanted to run, but my legs felt glued to the floor. We waited, breathless, for what felt like hours. Then the footsteps started again, coming down the stairs this time. I held my breath as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Sarah, or at least, it looked like her. But her face was pale, her eyes dark and empty, and her smile was twisted into something inhuman. "You stayed," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. Good. The lights went out completely, and the last thing I heard was her laughter, echoing through the darkness. When I woke up, I was alone in the house, the board sitting in the center of the room. Everyone else was gone, their coats, their bags, everything left behind. But the game was still there, and the planchette had moved one final time. It spelled out NEXTYOU. I ran, and I've never looked back. But every Christmas I hear that laughter in my dreams, and I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. The Christmas tree in our living room was perfect, tall, full, and sparkling with white lights and shiny ornaments. Mom had spent hours decorating it while humming carols. It was her favorite tradition, and this year, she made it extra special. Every ornament had its place, and I loved how the tree lit up the dark room at night. On Christmas Eve, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the tree, when something caught my eye. Near the bottom branch, a bright red ornament dangled, gleaming in the soft light. I frowned. That ornament hadn't been there before. I got up and crouched down to get a better look. It was unlike any of the others, dark red, almost like blood, with strange black swirls that seemed to shift when I stared at it. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my finger brushed the surface, a shiver ran through me. It felt cold, colder than anything I'd ever touched. I pulled my hand back quickly. "Mom," I called out, my voice trembling. "Did you put a new ornament on the tree?" She came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "What are you talking about?" I pointed to the red ornament, but when she looked, her face changed. Her usual warm smile faded, replaced by confusion. "I didn't hang that," she said quietly. "Are you playing a trick on me?" I shook my head. Something about her tone made my stomach twist. She stared at the ornament for a long moment before shaking her head. "Probably one of your friends messing around. Don't worry about it." But I couldn't stop worrying. That night, I woke up to a soft noise. like glass tapping against glass. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound was faint but steady, coming from the living room. My heart pounded as I got out of bed and crept down the hall. The Christmas tree lights were off, but the red ornament glowed faintly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The tapping sound grew louder as I approached, and then it stopped. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The ornament wasn't on the branch anymore. It was lying on the floor, rolling slowly toward me as if it had been pushed. I wanted to scream, but the sound stuck in my throat. I turned to run, but the air in the room felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. The shadows on the wall started to move, twisting and crawling toward me. Then I heard a voice, soft, raspy, and chilling. "You touched me." The words were barely audible, but they filled the room, echoing in my ears. The shadows formed a shape, a dark figure with long, spindly arms and hollow eyes. It reached for me, and the room went ice cold. I don't remember much after that. Mom found me the next morning, curled up on the floor in front of the tree. The red ornament was gone, and the branch where it had hung was charred black, as if burned. We never spoke about it again. Mom got rid of the tree that day, and I've never been able to look at Christmas decorations the same way. Sometimes, though, on quiet nights, I think I can still hear that tapping sound, faint and distant, as if it's waiting for me to touch it again.